You guys seem to really enjoy my last video that I did on cryptids, so I figured I would do a part 2. Here it is. My story involves myself and 3 of my really good friends throughout my whole childhood. We'll have them go by Kevin, Ryan, and Tommy, whom I am good friends with to this day. I could not write this story to you without their help, consent, and experiences as well. The story you are about to read is true and not made up in any way. Regardless of whether we had been seeing things or not, the reality is we had experienced something very horrifying one night at my friend Kevin's cabin. We thought long and hard about actually sharing it or not, afraid of being ridiculed, but we are ready to share with the community. And again, you had to be there to experience it. One of my friends had actually suffered a nervous breakdown after the incident and needed counseling in itself. Regardless, I would like you to know also I have always been a skeptic on the paranormal and find it very hard to believe in many aspects. But I love to watch, listen, and read on it, simply because I always love to have an open mind in life. An open mind, in my opinion, is a growing one. Whether it was paranormal or not, someone was clearly there that night. Now finally on with the story. During the midsummer, usually around the middle of July, I and a couple of my good friends, who I had mentioned, all the way through my childhood, always made time to go up to my one friend's family cabin way up north in the forest of Minnesota, cabin located on Vermilion Lake. Throughout all of our young years, we would always go, for sure accompanied by my friend's dad, Kevin's dad who owned the cabin, and sometimes a few of our dads as well. Once we were juniors in high school, we felt mature and old enough to go to the cabin on our own, finally without Kevin's dad or any other adult supervision that may have accompanied us. I would like to mention a little information in regards to my friend's cabin to help you picture the scenario. My friend's cabin is very remote and very little based upon a very large-sized island. Other cabins were on the island, but the next one closest to us was a solid quarter or half mile away at least, which is my best guess, which you could get to by taking a man-made path around the island. And I want to mention that to get to my friend's cabin, you had to park on a gravel road on the opposite side of the island, as his cabin was on an island, and take his boat across the lake about a half mile to reach the cabin. This lake is huge. My mind always had a tendency to run around when sleeping there at night throughout all my years, for it was all one level, with only 2 bedrooms next to one another, a kitchen living room connected, and a bathroom in the back of the cabin. And where you slept in the cabin, there was always at least one window in each room with no curtain to it at all, so it was very easy to see outside to the woods and lake, and this is where my mind would run, as I always thought someone was peering in. Of course, nobody ever was. I had been to this cabin a dozen times throughout my lifespan and nothing had ever happened, and the older I got, the easier it was to sleep. Now for the event, we usually would stay a week's worth or 4 or 5 nights. On the 3rd night during the trip, when we were there on our own, we had set up a campfire and had been drinking beer all night. I don't condone underage drinking, by the way. We just happened to sneak some, being the rebels we are. We went out to his dock to gaze up at the magnificent stars and enjoy our buzz when all of a sudden we heard something out in the water that sounded like a fish jumping out to catch a bug. We quickly looked out at the lake with curiosity, wondering where the splash came from, having our poles ready 24/7. Thankfully, the moon was out that night, which helped light up the lake. Otherwise, it would be dark as black, with there being no city lights for miles upon miles, and we would not have been able to see anything on the lake. My one friend, Ryan, began to point out, saying, what the hell is that?" After looking closely and finally spotting what he was pointing at, all I could describe was it simply looked like a head out in the middle of the lake. Just floating about, staring at us directly. It was about 3/4 worth of a football field length out in the lake from the dock. There is no question that I could see its features. It had long black hair and very palish skin like a face, but couldn't make out the eyes, mouth, nose, or chin, as if it was just a blob of pale skin with long black hair over it. I'll never forget the feeling that came over me. The hairs on my legs, neck, and arm all stood up, and I was paralyzed on the inside, ready to leave at that moment. But we told ourselves it was just a loon, as these birds are very popular night drifters on the lake and do their hunting late, and also have black with white colors on their coats. and hunt by diving deep into the water, holding their breath up to minutes sometimes. So it was possible that a loon all of a sudden popped up in the water after hunting a bit, or at least we tried to talk ourselves into that scenario. All of us had the creeps and noticed it wasn't moving one bit, just treading water in its same place. We went back to our campfire, lit it even brighter, and headed inside to drink more. I would like to mention that there was a staircase outside my friend's cabin about 8 stairs in length down to the bottom where the fire pit and dock was. We soon forgot about the head with the help of the beer, until I had to use the bathroom really bad and the one inside was preoccupied. I just went outside to do my business since we were in the great outdoors. I had been taking a pee and glancing out at the beautiful moonlit lake when I noticed that the black circle object was still there, but about 30 yards closer now. Still looking as if it was staring right at me. I could easily see the nose on this thing's face. Again, it was very pale, like it hadn't seen the sun for years. A very, very uneasy feeling came over me, and I immediately went inside, told my other friends to come look quickly, keeping my eyes glued to it at the door to the cabin. We came outside to see it still there looking at us as if this head was corked up at us with its chin in the air. Nobody dared go down to the dock anymore, and we immediately went back inside, ruling out that it probably wasn't a loon because a loon wouldn't have tread the water in the same spot. Eventually the current would have drifted it somewhere else in a rocking manner. For a loon to stay in the same spot for almost an hour or two made no sense to any of us. This head-like object was stiff as a board and not moving a single muscle, just staring up at us from the deck instead. There was no ripple effect at all in the lake from the object. We said it was just a log and went back in. I could tell everyone else felt uneasy too. A few hours would pass. It was super late into the night at this point and we knew we needed sleep. Being my curious self, I looked back outside once more, and the black object had completely vanished. I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief, thinking the log must have floated off or just hit shore somewhere. As we slept with the windows open that night, there was no AC in this cabin and we had to open them, or we would fry in his cabin with it being the middle of summer. Me and my other buddy, Tommy, slept in the living room while my 2 other friends slept in the 2 separate bedrooms with their doors open. Not being able to sleep but keeping my eyes peeled shut, I began to hear someone walking around at the bottom of the stairs to the cabin, around the campfire and at the bottom of the stair. I thought I was about to shit bricks. No question what or whoever I heard down there was off the dock now, pacing back and forth as it made the sound of a boot clicking on the wood. It was as if they weren't sure what to do with themselves, and it lasted for about 3 minutes. Wanting to whisper to my buddy, but frozen in fear, I just kept my eyes shut and ears on, full alert. The footsteps sounded like they took 2 steps up the deck stairs all of a sudden, but then turned around and sounded like they were sprinting out down the man-made path. After, it sounded like the steps were long gone, and a couple of minutes had passed. I woke up Tommy asking if he heard the steps, both of us sitting up. I was startled to my friend Ryan, walking out of his room and saying, "We need to leave a minute after these steps vanished." He must have heard us talking, so felt he could come out as well, but either way he was waking us up regardless. Something was very disturbing about his expression, and I asked him, "Why?" He woke up my other friend Kevin in the other room and said, "Let's go. Get to the boat. It's time to go." I asked him, "What? What? Ryan, what the hell is wrong with you?" He explained to us quickly while grabbing his stuff, and I will never forget what he explained, as won't my other friends. He said when he was turning sides on his bed to get more comfortable, he saw someone peeking in at the top right corner of his window and it quickly shifted out of his view. He said all he saw was one eye, ghostly white skin, and black hair long down the window. Again, another thing I would like to add. When we look back at what he experienced, it chills us to the bone, realizing that since this face was in the top right corner of the window in my friend's room that he was sleeping in, this thing either was damn near 8 feet tall, standing on something like bricks trying to peek in, or was floating. Ryan then continued to say, "Let's fucking go," very seriously. Absolutely disturbed the fuck out of my mind and feeling like I was going to be sick, and then telling them what my friend and I heard. In the living room, we all agreed and packed our stuff and booked it, not cleaning the cabin or anything. We always had to clean the cabin before leaving. We locked up, and as we headed down the stairs, we saw barefoot prints in the dirt heading off into the path and all around the cabin. We picked up our steps, getting to the boat, not knowing what was watching us or around us. Threw our stuff on the boat, untied it, and sped off. I didn't even think about the head in the water anymore, or to look in the water, thank God. My eyes were just glued to the island trying to spot anything moving, but I saw nothing. When we had finally gotten our stuff packed in the car and boat tied up, we hopped in the car and took off. We had been driving out about 10 miles, and out of the blue, Ryan, who said he saw the person outside his windows, all of a sudden broke down in the car sobbing, saying, "What was it, guys? Oh fuck, what did I see?" We called to tell our parents what had happened on the way back, and that Ryan was freaking out, and they told us to just get home safely and quickly. It was late, about 4 or 5 in the morning, but no one slept, and it was a very quiet ride home. My friend's dad, who owns the cabin, went up that following weekend and said he experienced nothing while there, but did mention bare footprints were still lingering about, which he thought odd because someone was walking around his property, which bugged him badly. Whatever my one friend saw in the window really hit him hard. After his breakdown, he had trouble sleeping multiple nights and ended up having to seek some help for a couple weeks and hop on some sleeping medicine. As time went on, he ended up being fine, but insisted on never sleeping next to a window without a curtain. I, to this day, cannot explain what happened and why it seemed to happen to us, and cannot explain what I saw in the lake and what Ryan specifically saw. Nothing has ever happened at that cabin since that night, or so we're told by my friend's dad, who owns it, which I believe him. I personally have never decided to go back to the cabin, which really makes me sad because I had great childhood memories there. Tommy and Kevin both have gone back and been fine, but Ryan refuses to go back and I'm with him. A lot of people have cabins on this island, so it could have been a prank in the makings that had been busted when Ryan saw the person at the window, or the person possibly wanting to do something worse. I will never be able to explain what was floating in the lake, but the fact that this incident, along with bare feet and someone looking in at Ryan at night, all happened in the same night seems like more than a coincidence. This incident occurred during the summer of 1983, as I was about to begin my senior year in high school. My family lived in rural Pennsylvania, in northern Indiana County. Our farmhouse was built in the mid-1800s. In the early 1900s, an addition was added to the back that more than doubled the size of the original house. The original house was a 4-square house, so-called for the 4 square rooms, 2 on the first floor and 2 on the second floor, with a staircase in the back. The house as a whole was sturdy, albeit a bit cranky. Every night in summer I fell asleep listening to the pops, cracks, creaking, and groans as the house cooled off in the night air. The house was built on high ground, next to the mouth of an ancient ravine that ran for over a mile, deeper and darker and rockier as it went down to the north branch of the Little Mahoning Creek. The ravine was heavily wooded at the beginning. Then the trees sparsened to a few old ones tenaciously rooted into the eroded rocks and glacial till. It was dark and cool and damp down in there, even on the hottest summer day, and I spent many summer days down in those woods. I knew the plants, the trees, the birds, and the deer. I heard much I couldn't see, like the rabbits running through the brush and the squirrels high up scolding me as I walked. I could sense the ones that hid and made no noise, the bobcats lurking and the nocturnal critters peeking at my back after I passed their burrows. Sometimes sudden waves of total silence would descend on the woods. The air would be still. The birds would silence themselves. I taught myself to stop at these moments and to observe. I knew it wasn't me that made the animals go silent, so I figured something, a bobcat perhaps, was close by. I never saw what it was that caused the silences, but I loved to imagine myself as a skilled tracker. Nothing of the sort, of course, but I will claim to know those woods. I also had a bosom friend and companion as I roamed the woods and ravines around my home, a big male German shepherd named Chap. Chap loved to run and roam and chase groundhogs. We prowled along through the woods for years. This particular night I awoke suddenly, very awake and alert. The wind was blowing against the open window. Our room had the crank-out windows that were popular in the 70s, when the hose had been remodeled. The bottom of the window tilted out and the rain ran off. There was a low rumble off in the distance, the thunder of a summer storm blowing in from the west. I was laying on my belly, my face on its left side on my pillow, and my arms around and under my pillow. I listened to the rain. It was not unusual for me to wake up in the middle of the night. It's been a regular occurrence in my life since I was very young. By that point, at 17 years old, I was used to my 3 a.m. ritual, though still very irritated by it. Across the room, I could hear my brother breathing. I could hear our dog, lying on the foot on my brother's bed, sniffing at the rainy night air blowing in the window. Across the hall from our room, I could hear my dad's low, steady, rumbling snore. Then I heard something that made my eyes fly open in the pitch-black room. From down in the ravine, off in the distance, I heard an animal call unlike any I had ever heard. It was a roar, an angry roar. To the best of my knowledge, the apex predator in those woods was the bobcat. This was too deep, too throaty for a bobcat. Then I heard it again. Surprisingly closer. A lot closer. I listened for my brother's breathing. Silence. He was awake. "What is that?" I loudly whispered. "I don't know," he whispered back. There was obvious concern in his voice. Then we heard it again. It had to be no more than 75 feet from the house, down at the corner of the year where the trail led into the woods and down to the ravine. First of all, it was no damn bobcat. It was not a dog, not a coyote, and it was most definitely not a man. Next to my bed was a softball bat. Still have it, as a matter of fact. That night, all I wanted in the world was to slide my hand out from under my pillowed head and reach down and grab that ball bat. But I couldn't move. Everyone in the house seemed paralyzed. I kept expecting to hear my dad throw his bedroom door open, but he never made a sound. Then two things happened, in rapid succession. There was a tremendous crash, like something or someone had ran headlong into the house. Then there was another roaring, screaming howl, this time right next to the house. It was an angry, roaring shout so loud I felt like it was next to my face. I had never, in all my life, heard an animal make a noise that loud. It was like a V8 engine with straight pipes was running wide open throttle. At the same time, there was a throbbing, a low-frequency growl that seemed to make the house vibrate. All I could do was close my eyes and try to scream, but nothing came out. I must have passed out. The next thing I know, it was morning. The sun was shining. The house was still there. I slept in, which was very unusual in my family. I went downstairs. My dad and brother had already left for the day. My mom stood at the sink washing dishes. I looked at my mom wide-eyed. Surely she heard what happened. She met my eyes and pointed to the back porch of our house, a small side room that housed the washing machine, dryer, and coat closet. I walked to the back porch to see that the door that led to the outside had been ripped from its hinges and lay flat on the floor of the porch. In the coat closet, with his nose pressed as far back as it could go, laying in a puddle of his own urine, was Chap. He lay there, whimpering, for 2 days before he finally came out. I was given the task to fix the door. When it was up and repaired, I went to my mom and basically asked, "Are we going to pretend that nothing happened last night?" My mom sighed with obvious exasperation and said something along the lines of, "Well, what would you like to know? You know what that was? Your dad knows? I know. We all know. Not much to talk about, other than how scary it was, and frankly, I don't need to talk about that, thank you." And for my family, that was pretty much the end of it. I brought it up once not long ago. My dad shrugged. I know as much now as I did that night. Me. I drive by there on occasion when I'm in the area. I stop on the old country road and listen a while. I listen to the wind and the birds. I listen a while, and then I drive on. So this happened last year. My aunt likes to travel a lot now that she's retired, and she'll ask me to take her to the airport. She lives about an hour outside of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, in a place that's pretty rural. She doesn't like traveling out of Philadelphia International Airport and will instead go to Newark Liberty International Airport. So last year, she decided to go to South and Central America for a month and asked me to come to her house to drive her since she didn't trust my brother to actually show up when he said he would. I met her at her place the night before, went to bed for a few hours, and then we left in her car at 1 a.m. so she could get to the airport in time. We decided to take her car because it's a mid-sized SUV and held her luggage better than my sedan did. I guess we had been on the road for about 20 minutes. I'm not entirely sure because my perception of the passage of time isn't amazing, but we had to drive through a lot of small little old villages. Not sure what else to call them, they were basically clumps of 10 houses in a small area. The homes were all super close to the road, like basically right on top of it, which helped to note them as being a lot older. None of the lights were on, not even candle lamps in the windows. And if you're from PA, you know what I'm talking about with those lamps. They're everywhere. The area had a lot of woods. It was overall just very creepy and very foggy out. We were driving along and all of a sudden we came up on something. It was facing toward a telephone pole off to the right of the car. The pole was just in front of a garage or small barn structure. All I could see was the back of its head, completely white, no hair, and its hands and its forearms, which were also totally white. It looked like it was wearing a dark shirt or something of that nature. But it was facing away from us, leaning into the telephone pole with its arms up against the pole and its head against its arms, or at least a stance similar to that. The worst feeling I have ever felt rose up in my chest when I saw it. I felt my heart almost stop and drop into my stomach. I felt sick and terrified. All I knew was that whatever it was, I didn't want it to turn around, no matter what. I knew it couldn't be allowed to turn around, or I would regret it. I've seen a lot of really weird things in my life and felt a lot of really weird sensations. I've always been super sensitive to the energy in homes, and I have straight up seen ghosts in my parents' home, one of which I am very wary of, the other I am comforted by, but that's a different story for a different time. But this was actually terrifying. I cannot explain the immense feeling of dread and horror I experienced in that moment to you. You could only understand if you've experienced it yourself. We passed by it so quickly, and it was so late that I thought I must have imagined it. But that feeling stuck with me. I didn't say anything to my aunt. I thought she didn't see it either. But about 10 seconds after we went past it, she says, "Did you..." And then a long pause. "Did you see that thing?" We talked about it. She described to me exactly what I saw, and I knew right then and there that I was going to be terrified to drive back to her home to switch cars at 4 or 5 a.m. when I got back to her place from the airport, by myself. And all I could think is that I didn't want that thing to be there, because I would hit it if it came into the road, and I wouldn't stop to check if I did. It wasn't going to get to me. Luckily, it wasn't there when I drove past the same area again on the way to her home. And believe me, I was hyper-aware the entire way there. I was even terrified to walk from her front door to my car. I ran and locked myself in as soon as I sat down and shut the car door. The next time I drove her to the airport, I looked for it, but it wasn't there. I haven't seen it since. I've only told a couple friends about it, and one of them and her best friend saw something similar peeking at them around the back side of her house when they were sitting in her car one night. She also lives in rural Pennsylvania, 19 miles from me, 40-minute drive, and I'm 22-ish miles outside of Philly, also roughly 40-minute drive. She also lives out in the woods. Have any of you ever experienced something like this? I saw a video once online of something that just had a white head and white long legs walking around, and it didn't look like that. This thing was tall and had distinct arms and legs. It had no hair whatsoever on its body. I don't know if it had facial features because it was faced towards the pole, almost like it was counting for hide-and-go-seek with its arms up. It might have been hugging onto the pole. It wore something black. And I experienced the worst and most deeply jolting fear in its presence, and I was only near to it for a few seconds. Sorry it has taken me a while to post this. Been extremely busy lately, unfortunately. First off, I have told this story before. in a public setting around 2008. I was living in Louisiana at the time and had called into Coast to Coast AM and told this story to George Noory, which was a pretty cool experience. I didn't have a whole lot of time to tell some of the details, so you'll be getting the unedited version, so to speak. It happened somewhere between 1997 and 1999. I was in my late teens, and we were living in New Mexico, up near the Four Corners. My parents were pastors at a local church in a very small town. We had lived outside of town, sort of out in the middle of nowhere, and there were a few houses sprinkled around us. Surrounding was, at least where there were no houses, there was some brush and a lot of desert. Ever since we moved there, the locals told us about skinwalkers. Even people in the church warned us about them. One guy in the church swore up and down that when he was a truck driver, he saw a skinwalker in its human form running alongside his truck when he was going about 80 miles per hour. But since I didn't witness it, I just took him at his word. I had heard many different tales on the origins of the skinwalkers, both from the locals and the Native Americans. There was a Native American who went to our church who still held on to his Navajo beliefs, who told me what I always assumed to be a more accurate description. He told me that when people of his tribe had a child out of incest, the tribe leaders take the baby out into the desert to be raised by wolves. The wolves would raise it and they would become skinwalkers, having the powers to turn into anything, animals, humans, etc. The story fascinated me. He just seemed to know for sure that this was the accurate tale. Then he warned me to never whistle at night, which I thought was pretty weird, but I never did until one night. It was in the fall, around 11 at night. I was in my bedroom, which was the furthest room from anyone in the house and near the garage, watching TV or playing PlayStation. My mother was in her bedroom, my dad was at the church, studying as he always did till around midnight. My brother had a friend over that night, and they were going to spend the night on the back patio, which was a long rectangular room with screen windows all down it. Like I said, I was in my bedroom minding my business when my brother and his friend come banging on my door. Annoyed, I opened the door, and my brother, who is 4 years younger than me, and his friend are both frightened. My brother said, as they were in the patio goofing off, they heard someone walking around the backyard and saw what looked to be the top of a white bald head walk by the screen windows. Now, normally I would believe my brother since he would never make this kind of stuff up. But his friend was a huge liar and had told tall tales about having been to Mars, even showing us the red dirt, which looked an awful lot like the red dirt you could find throughout the area, I might add. Of course, by this time I had experienced a lot of paranormal stuff, but I was still skeptical. Bravely and annoyed, I grabbed my jacket and a flashlight, and the three of us went out to the patio. It was always creepy at night because it was always so dark, and the only light came from a nearby lamppost a few yards down the street. Our backyard was insanely small except for the right-hand side of it, which was a bit bigger but held a trampoline which took up the better part of it. We stepped out of the patio, my flashlight shining around the yard, but saw nothing. That was when I started hearing the crunching of leaves coming from the front yard, so the three of us went through the back gate to the front yard. Now, our front yard was huge and had roughly 9 apple trees. There was even a large creepy tree in the corner of the yard near the street I always stayed clear of for some reason. We had a close neighbor, literally on the other side of the wooden fence. It was a nice family that had a daughter about my brother's age, and they also had a bunch of chickens, and sometimes they would wander into our yard. So that is what I thought was walking around our front yard. Shining the flashlight around, of course I couldn't see any chickens, but I did see something white walk behind a tree near the wooden fence. That was when I got very curious. The three of us walked slowly to the tree. I was being the protective big brother and kept the other two behind me. Before I knew it, I heard a loud whoosh and felt a gust of wind, like something flew by us. My brother screamed out in pain. My brother always had his shirt off, which annoyed me because back then I was overweight and very self-conscious, but I noticed on his chest he had 3 long scratches across him. Scared and shocked, my brother ran back inside the house, leaving me and his friend. It all happened so quickly, but I ran towards the street where I was sure whatever it was had gone, his friend close behind me. Once we reached the end of our property, I could hear the sound of bare feet running down the paved road. I shined my light towards the sound, but never saw anything. So I whistled some tune, and from down the road I heard the same tune whistled back to me. Intrigued, I whistled again, this time a different tune, and again the same tune was whistled back. My brother's friends started getting scared and kept trying to get me to go back inside, but I was very intrigued. I whistled for the third time, and that was when, very close by, we both heard a male voice say, "Hey kid, come here." There was no hesitation, the two of us bolted back inside. We went to go tell my mother what happened, and she was already frightened because she was tending to my brother's scratches on his chest. We told her what happened, and my mother told us to stay inside. My mother has had some pretty scary paranormal encounters before. I need to tell those stories soon as well, so she believed us. I have never forgotten that encounter. My brother brushes it off these days, making out to be not a big deal, but I know differently, as does my mother. It's one of the many incidents in my life that literally bothers me to this day. I've been debating on sharing this story with anyone outside of my small circle of people that were there. But I want to share my experience in hopes that it saves someone's life, or to give understanding of what someone else has experienced. Late fall 2010. In northern Canada, I went deep into the wilderness with my father and my eldest brother to hunt for moose. We left in the early morning just before sunrise, trying to cover as much distance as possible before nightfall. We traveled winding rivers and had to repeatedly portage over rapids all day. We decided to set up camp just over halfway to our destination. My father figured that we'd make the rest of the journey tomorrow. Well, when everyone bedded down for the night, I decided to go grab some firewood and relieve myself down by the bank of the river, just out of reach of the light from the campfire. Out from the tree line, about 15 yards away. I could hear rustling in the bushes. I watched the area where I heard the noise and focused on that spot. I felt kind of funny, dizzy, lightheaded, and I could smell this putrid stink like old milk or rotten food. Then I saw the trees start to morph and move ever so slightly and began to take the shape of a head and slight facial features. My eyes began to adjust to the darkness, and along the tree line, I could hear this voice coming from there. I recognized it. The voice sounded like one of my relatives who had recently passed. The face took shape of my relative. "Hello?" They said. "I've missed you. Come see me?" I smiled and stepped forward a bit, but stopped to analyze the situation. My relative's face stopped smiling and became emotionless. The skin began to turn pale and peel away. Chunks of flesh from their cheeks began to fall away, and I felt shock and fear overwhelm my body. I couldn't make sense of it at all, so I started to back away and make my way to camp. I didn't realize at the time that I had been walking towards the voice and I was further away from the firelight. The voice became angry and began shouting at me to come here. So I turned to run away. But as I looked back one more time, I saw the most disgusting thing I had ever seen. It was rotting flesh on gnawed bone, caved-in eyes and a hollow chest cavity. This humanoid creature was tall and super thin. I ran as fast as I could, trying to yell for help. But the fear had made my voice quiet and raspy. I ran along the riverbank, and I could hear the heavy breaths and the stomping feet from this thing right behind me. I made it onto the top of the riverbank, but it grabbed a hold of my leg as I jumped up. I gripped and tore the grass, trying to lift myself, and yelled as loud as I could. Then finally my voice came back, and I yelled that someone has my leg. My brother woke up and ran over to where I was. Then he pulled me up and took me over to the fire. I was terrified, trying to explain what I saw and that it looked like my relative, but not. I was trying to convince them that I wasn't seeing things, but my brother nodded his head and said, "I saw it too, I know." That solidified it. He acknowledged that it was real. We stayed up all night after that, rifles loaded and close by. We packed up when the sun was coming up and went back home. We haven't shared that story with anyone out of fear of being labeled as crazy or liars. I've had nightmares and couldn't sleep for months afterwards. I would see things, dark figures looking into my window, or hear whispers when I was walking home at night. Eventually, I was seeing this dark figure daily. I went to medicine men shaman for help, but I've learned that the ceremonies only relieves it temporarily. Friends have given me everything from protection pouches to certain crystals. I found out that there's a strong possibility that I encountered a Wendigo. I learned that if you encounter one and survive, it attaches itself to you like a parasite. I learned that it could only do this if it touches you, which it did. Ever since that night, I've been on edge when I enter any forest or wooded area, which sucks because I loved being outdoors, hunting, and in nature. Now I always feel like I need to keep my back against something when I'm out in the wild. Anyways, make your own conclusions about this. I've paid a price for being an ignorant child to the stories of old. They are real, I can attest to that. Stay safe, everyone. Now, before I go further, I will state I am a practicing occultist. So I have had some off-the-wall experiences before, but none like this. So at the time, I was living in a suburb north of Chicago. About half an hour away is the Wisconsin border. Locals on both sides have heard and speak of it. It has been called different names in the late 60s. On the Illinois side, it was known as the Bull Valley Beastman. Recall my uncle speaking about it when I was 12, and he seemed nervous even talking about it, and he never saw it. The general public probably knows it, or them, as the Bray Road Werewolf. At the time I worked a night shift, so on my days off I was a night owl. That night a friend had invited me over. It was near 11 at night, so I crossed the highway and got on this bike trail near the train tracks. So to the left of me was this large field, and on my right train tracks and the highway. After I got to the point where there were some trees that covered the field, I got this weird feeling. All of a sudden I heard movement in the trees, thought it was a deer perhaps because it was moving the smaller trees as it moved forward. My first instinct was to give it some room to pass until I heard this growl, and my first thought was, shit, a badger. Then a second later it hit me, this is at least as large as a deer and moving large tree branches, not a badger. Then it growled about 10 times louder. Now it was moving my way faster and breaking branches. I immediately turned and ran across the train track and onto the highway, not even looking to see if any cars were coming. Once I hit the other side of the street, did not stop running for about 50 feet, and turned my head and saw about 3 cars coming. I looked across the road and could see a crouching humanoid shape at least 6 feet tall, hid between 2 train cars watching me. It seemed to be scared to be seen to run in front of the cars, so I hauled ass and did not stop running for about 3 blocks. Did not stop till I reached this well-lit area where there was this cluster of factories and a closed auto store. Even then did not feel safe. Till I reached the old downtown area. There was a 24-hour gas station and a few open bars. I slowed my pace and walked a block to my friend's house. All the time I was trying to absorb what had happened. See, this was no spirit that was conjured in a ritual, nor was it a ghost or poltergeist. It, whatever it was, a bipedal animal that had probably stalked me since long before it charged me. But I will say that I sensed it, some atavism kicked in, perhaps augmented by my previous experiences, warned me. That was the weirdest thing, the sense of uneasiness that preceded it. That and the loud growl that was very inhuman. Anyway, I got to my friend's house, and he had his front door open, and I still remember hearing KMFDM jamming and knocking on the screen door and him coming to the door. He asked if I was all right. I just pushed past him and grabbed 2 beers from the case we had not finished the night before and said, "Brian, sit down, you're not going to believe this." Now at that point, we were both delving into chaos magic, and he had already experienced some paranormal phenomena. He spent the rest of that night packing bowls of pot till 9 the next morning talking with me. We were throwing out all these theories about what it could actually be and if it was possible that it is able to walk through dimensions, and that is why no corpses of these things are ever found. Then it was the counter-argument that it did not act like any human occult intelligence we had encountered before. This was something that was unclassifiable. I am an outdoorsman. I'm very experienced in hunting, camping, hiking, and general survival. I'm very familiar and used to wildlife, and I was charged by what I believe was a cryptid called a dogman. It charged me and my cousin. It was not a bear cannot move how it did, and it was not a normal wolf as they can't comfortably run on two legs, whereas what charged us seemed natural at doing. This happened around June or July of 2007, I believe. I was around 17 years old and more cocky then, but still somewhat knowledgeable of the outdoors. My family used to own a cabin in northwestern Wisconsin. I basically grew up there in the summer. I knew the woods well, but at night it was wise to stay in the cabin or at least by the bonfire by the beach because of bears, wolves, and cougars. One of the creepiest things was if you were having a bonfire, the tree line was visible from the fire pit and beach, and at night you always felt like you were being watched from that tree line. But during the day the woods always seemed normal, not so creepy. That is until this incident. So this happened somewhere between 1200 and 1400. Me and my cousin were having an airsoft battle. I was in full woodland camo. He was not. I retreated onto the ATV trail into the woods for a tactical advantage, and our battle took us about 200 meters in to about a third of the way up the trail. We had enough at this point, and were standing at the edge of a clearing on the trail talking, and he was maybe 10 feet from me when I decided to mess with him. I shushed him and said, "We're being watched." He froze. Then I realized the woods were dead quiet, and I got spooked and started scanning the tree line and the other edge of the clearing from left to right when I saw it. Its teeth gave it away. It was panting and staring at my cousin. I don't expect you to believe me. But what I saw was a wolf as big as a black bear, at least 300 pounds, but it wasn't normal. This wolf was on two legs crouching next to a tree with its arm grasping the tree, grasping with a clawed hand. It had reddish-brown fur. I told my cousin that we have to go, and next thing I know he is sprinting, and I look back at Wolfie who had locked on and sprinted a few steps on 2 feet, and then I turned and ran when it looked like Wolfie was dropping to all fours. It charged us and sounded right on our asses barreling through the brush, but for whatever reason let us go when we broke out of the tree line and headed for the cabin. What stuck with me the most was the sheer size. Wolfie appeared to be nearly 7 feet tall when upright, and that where it should have had front paws, it appeared to have large clawed hands. Now, I'm not sure how to explain it away rationally. I have heard wolves will occasionally kind of walk upright, but as far as I know they can't sprint on 2 legs, nor do wolves get that big, and black bears more waddle on 2 legs. The closest description is silly, a werewolf or dogman. Thank you for reading. I want to share some experiences I had a few years ago. I've posted this story on another website while the occurrences were happening to try and understand the situation a little better, but I think you guys will enjoy it. I've also shared this on another sub. I just want to mention a few key points before I share some of the things that happened. I am not looking for fame nor attention, and everything contained within is 100% factual. I am an Australian. These occurrences happened on the central coast of New South Wales. I am an avid outdoorsman with a keen interest and in-depth knowledge of Australian native fauna. Each of these occurrences have a witness apart from myself. I don't claim these events are paranormal, yet I am, to this day, still without a reasonable explanation. Occurrence 1. I live on the NSW's central coast, in an area that has houses in close proximity to Brisbane Water National Park, literally within meters from some back fences. Myself and my partner hold a keen interest which sees us venture into bushland regularly. For argument's sake, let's say we are avid bird watchers. A few weeks ago, the local fire service commenced backburning in parts of the Brisbane Water National Park over 2 or so days, which was obviously for hazard reduction. Most of the fire was directed at burning off leaf litter and dry debris which covers the ground in an effort to reduce the chances of spot fires, which have in the past become large fires and threatened houses and caused neighboring suburbs to be evacuated. Because of the way the backburning was controlled, it completely burned off the debris, and basically 90% of flora that was over 2 or so feet seemed to have survived, except some charring, of course. Even some grass plants survived, while others were completely burned, including their underground roots, which left large round circles in the substrate. This meant the canopy was fully intact. This is an important point in my story. The fire was controlled so well that the left-hand side was completely obliterated by fire while the right-hand side was untouched. The path is about 3 to 4 feet wide at its widest points. Anyway, about 48 hours after the fire service had finished back burning, my partner and myself ventured into a large patch of Brisbane Water National Park, along a track we have walked no less than 200 times in the last 10 years. The first thing we noticed, of course, was the lack of small shrubs and ground cover, which had been replaced by a 3/4 centimeter layer of ash. It was also hard not to notice the smell and non-visible smokiness which irritated our throats and noses, but by far the most profound thing we noticed was just how quiet it was. Usually we hear birds chirping, snakes slithering into the underbrush, lizards scampering out of the way, and ducks splashing around in the creek that runs along the whole length of the walking track on the right. Across the creek there are literally kilometers of bush in all directions, so it was a little odd that it was so desolate even after backburning. We decided to press on even though we were pretty sure that we weren't going to see any wildlife. We continued along the track for about another 20 minutes, all the while chatting about nothing in particular, when all of a sudden we both jerk our heads to the left to see 2 vertical vines, which stand at about 6 foot tall and 4 centimeters or so in circumference, come towards us. Like they have been shook, held back, and released towards us, kind of like a slingshot. We immediately run over to the trees 4 meters or so off the track, because we thought it may have been caused by wildlife. My first instinct was to look up, as it may have been a large bird fleeing, but there were no birds at all in any of the trees, and we would have seen and heard the wing flapping and it breaking through the canopy. It wasn't any type of goanna, as we only have 2 types, which occur naturally here, and both are arboreal, and will take to the nearest tree when threatened. We checked every tree, every hollow log, and any type of ground cover which survived the fire, and found nothing. It definitely wasn't any type of marsupial, because it would have been spotted when we checked the trees and surrounding ground cover. It also wasn't any type of snake, as the only arboreal snake we have locally, which weighs in kilos, is the diamond python, which I could spot from a mile away. We continued walking for another 3 kilometers or so along the track, and the whole time felt like we were being watched, and I was quite uneasy, but that feeling completely left as soon as we turned around and backtracked and headed towards home. Occurrence 2 and 3. I believe this is the first time I have shared these. My partner and myself went out on another adventure, but this time we were looking for nocturnal animals to photograph. We went to a waterfall which was only about 15 minutes from our house, but is rather secluded and completely dead at night and on weekdays. Funnily enough, it becomes packed on the weekends during the day in the warmer months. The layout of the waterfall is basically a large parking lot at the stop of the waterfall, which has a small park with BBQs, tables, and a small block of toilets. From the parking lot, you can also access the very top of the waterfall, which is basically a rock escarpment with water running through it. You can also access stairs that take you down to both the middle of the waterfall, which is just a huge rock platform, and the very bottom of the waterfall. It takes about 20 minutes to walk from top to bottom. Anyway, we parked the car, and I grabbed my gear, which included my camera. We start making our way towards the top of the falls, which has a 2-foot barrier you have to step over to access the rock escarpment. Right, as I went to put my leg over the fence, I heard the most disturbing noise I've ever heard. It sounded like a human moaning in pain, but to describe it, the best I can imagine having 10 different people with 10 different voice qualities, all making the same moaning sound at the same time. I'm not one to frighten easily, but I have to admit it sent chills up my spine. I told my partner to hurry up and get back to the car, and I locked the doors as soon as we got in and left in a hurry. Now, this place is pitch dark. There are 0 lights, and there is no way in hell you'd be there without a torch. Not to mention you'd be able to tell if anyone was there by the cars parked in the parking lot, as this isn't a place you'd walk to. When I told a close friend of mine who also frequents the waterfall to photograph wildlife, he told me he also had an experience the night before, the night after I was there. He had finished work late and thought he'd go for a quick walk around to see what he could find. This was in the Australian spring when everything is out and about due to the warm and humid weather. He said he had parked his car and got about halfway down the stairs to the bottom of the falls when he came across a snake. He was photographing it when he heard the door of the toilet block being slammed repeatedly. He started running up the steps to get back to his car and said as he was running up it sounded like something was going, mental slamming things within the toilet block. He got in his car and left. My friend and I decided to go check out the waterfall that night to see if we could find anything. We parked the car and went straight to the toilet block. We checked the block that he heard the commotion in and found a reasonable amount of blood inside the basin and a small pool in the basin's soap dish. We contemplated calling the police but weren't sure exactly what we would say. We left soon after and neither of us visited that place for over a month afterwards. Since then, we have been back to this place multiple times without incident. Occurrence 4, the last occurrence. Taken from the forum I first posted on. Now on to last night. We headed out along a road on the Central Coast, which by day is rather busy due to the high number of residences and farms that are along this road. By night, it is usually very quiet with a few cars using it sporadically, so I have my high beams on 95% of the time. We drove along this road for about 40 minutes in search of marsupials to photograph. This road intersects large masses of bush on both sides. I would also like to add at this point that this road is not straight or level by any means. There are a mixture of turns as well as slight to aggressive inclines and declines along basically the entirety of this road. After driving for 40 minutes without any luck, we decided to head back along the same route we took. We were driving for about 10 to 15 minutes on our way back when we hit one of the very slight gradual inclines along the road. When we were about halfway up the incline, I noticed something in the distance, maybe 200 to 250 meters or so, which I initially thought was a shadow being cast from residual lighting of my high beams when all of a sudden it moved from the middle of the road to the right side. At this point, and while the figure was still in motion, I asked the passenger, and the person who has been present for the 3 unexplained experiences, "Can you see that?" To which they replied, "Yes, what is that?" We got to the top of the incline and onto level ground once again and stopped in the location we saw it. I stopped and I pulled out one of my torches and surveyed where we had seen it. To my surprise, where it had crossed to was a small property which was essentially a house with a very small paddock with horses out the front. But what caught my attention was the horses were not startled in the slightest and could actually see one of them close to the fence eating.